Hello and welcome. I'm Nora, like Heather said, and I'm the candidate for the Faculty for Business and Law. And my PhD investigates the influence of global agricultural production networks on processes of water governance. And I will tell you in a second what that exactly means. First, my apologies for not being here in person. I've just moved to New Zealand for a postdoctoral position, and so it was a little bit far to just pop over, but thank you to Jennifer for facilitating this by conference call. I now quickly want to give you an overview about my presentation. I will first tell you a little bit more about my research, to then describe the context of the research and the methods I've used, and then go on to the juicy bits, my findings, to then wrap up by quickly emphasizing why this research matters. So why or what does the influence of global agricultural production networks on processes of water governance actually mean? It means I have been investigating how the production of agricultural goods, such as fruit, impacts not only on the environment in terms of its various environmental footprints, but also influences the way we manage natural resources and the way we make decisions about them. And this matters because we have been struggling to manage and govern our natural resources in a sustainable manner. While at the same time, many of our economies, including the British one, are increasingly embedded in global value and supply chains, and therefore reliant upon agricultural goods traded from across the globe. So in very short, it's about the relationship between the way our economy is organized and the way we manage and make decisions about the natural resources that support this economy. And for this purpose, in my PhD, I combine elements of global production network theory with literature with water governance literature. And this still remains a fairly broad topic or research area. So for my PhD, I narrowed it down. And my thesis focuses on how the export-oriented fruit industry in South Africa's Western Cape influences the way water is managed and governed locally. And by governing water or water governance, I mean the way societies make decisions about water, in particular the question of water allocation. So who gets how much water and why? And this is a political process because it relates to the question of gaining access to resources, or who gets access to a resource and who does not. And the Western Cape in South Africa is really an ideal and very interesting case study for this type of research for several reasons. First, it has a very large export-oriented agricultural industry based mainly on the production of fruit for export, which plays an important role for economic development of the region, as well as employment creation, two very important topics in present-day South Africa. At the same time, the Western Cape is fairly water scarce and prone to extreme events, including droughts, such as the recent Cape Town drought you might have heard about in the news. And despite this water scarcity, about 42 to 87% of all available water in the region is allocated to commercial agriculture, most of it to the production of fruit for export. This, as you can imagine, creates a potential for conflict between the commercial fruit production industry and other water users that compete for limited water resources. To make it a bit more complicated, in South Africa, this situation is exacerbated by the country's apartheid legacy. Apartheid was a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination that ended in 1994, but it gave preferential access to land and water resources to the ruling white minority. And since 1994, South Africa as a country has been struggling to rectify the inequalities that were engineered by the apartheid state. And particularly in the Western Cape, the legacies are still evident, and the export farming industry remains heavily dominated by white South Africans. So this is a bit the context. How did I go about my research? I spent 4 months in South Africa itself to collect data. My main data source were semi-structured interviews. I conducted 76 interviews with a range of stakeholders, including fruit producers, representatives from industry organizations, representatives from NGOs, as well as different levels of government and different government departments. And this was supported by farm visits, a policy analysis, as well as the analysis of industry and NGO reports, and the attendance of various workshops related to the topic. So what did I find? I found that the Western Cape fruit industry faces a series of water risks that threaten its ability to supply lucrative export markets, mostly located in Europe. And to mitigate these water risks, the fruit industry deploys a set of overlapping strategies. And these strategies mitigate water risks at the farm level, collaboratively with other local actors, and at the policy level through lobbying. And the purpose of these strategies is to ensure water security for the production of export fruit. And in my PhD, I described these strategies and the water risks they mitigate in detail. What I want to emphasize in this presentation is the implications of these water risk mitigating strategies. So while these strategies are very efficient or successful at ensuring water security for food producers, I find that in my research, they also have more far-reaching impacts, and some of these are negative. And the negative impacts manifest because these strategies have influence on the South African water governance regime as a whole, and not only in relation to the fruit industry. And the main effect is that they depoliticize the question of water allocation. And within the South African context, this is problematic. You might ask, why is this problematic? It is problematic because the way these strategies depoliticize water allocation has frustrated important efforts of post-apartheid water reform. Water reform summarizes the efforts of the South African society to redress the inequalities and injustices engineered by the apartheid state in terms of accessing water. And in my thesis, I show how, despite the political reorientation after apartheid in 1994, and despite these efforts of water reform, the export-oriented fruit industry has maintained preferential access to water to produce high-value crops for export. And this results in the perpetuation of inequalities in terms of access to water resources, but also in terms of having inequality in the access to the benefits of water resources, such as being able to access irrigation water to produce export crops, participate in global markets, and make profits, for example. Now, why does this matter? First, water risks can threaten the supply of fresh fruit to global markets. And this is of concern not only for fruit producers themselves, but also for so-called lead firms or supermarkets sourcing from these areas who need to have a certain assurance of supply. Second, these strategies, the implemented strategies to mitigate water risks are inadequate in the long term, as they have a negative impact on the wider social and environmental sustainability of the production region. And this is bad in itself, but it can also reinforce existing water risks or lead to new ones. And therefore, if we consider the ever-increasing imperative of ensuring sustainable, ethical, and responsible production of goods, I argue that future strategies to mitigate water and other environmental risks cannot only focus on the immediate supply and value chain, but really need to consider the wider ecological and social political dynamics of a specific region to be effective. That's it from me already. Thank you for your attention. And again, apologies for not being here in person.